These are three areas, general areas that I think you can look at to determine how much latitude a CEO is going to have to change things or to exert an influence on an organization. So you have the external factors, and sometimes these can be powerful. For example, if you're in a very heavily regulated industry, if you're in a very mature industry with lots of set institutional norms, it can be a little bit hard to make some changes. However, I think it's very dangerous to conclude on that bottom bullet, room for innovation, that the answer is ever none. You may not have a lot of innovation possible on the product side, but there could be lots of opportunities for process innovation and then innovation within the organization. So the external limits person, and then the person also limits the person. You see that the qualities there that are looked at for personal attitude in a big corporation where you have the ability to attract high quality CEO candidates, you would expect that the person would be very strong on all of these points. Because if they're not, why did you hire them in the first place? As the organization gets smaller, though, you may not be able to be, quite frankly, as choosy. And if it's a founder-based organization, they may have certain limitations that they would be well to be advised of. And that's why later on in the textbook chapter, they talk about the emotional intelligence. That's an excellent section to read, if for no other reason that you can evaluate yourself as how you measure up on those points. So what I want to spend a little bit longer time talking about are aspects of the organization. One would think that old organizations and large organizations are harder to have latitude on. And in general, that would be seen as true, but they're not excuses. Sometimes old organizations are ripe for renovations. Sometimes large organizations understand that they're facing a death experience, that they're at that strategic inflection point, and they need to do something about it. Organizational culture is huge, and I'm going to talk more about that in the next slide, but often when a leader comes in, the culture will dictate how much latitude they have and where they have latitude. And so if the CEO doesn't think that the culture is where it needs to be on those points, job one is going to be to change the culture. Resources are also important. Sometimes when you inherit an underperforming organization, you're just trying to keep the wheels on it, much less do anything to make substantial changes. But those those bottom 3 points are something I want you to particularly think about. One is past performance. What does good past performance do to the latitude of a new CEO? It tends to limit it because people are fat, dumb, and happy going, hey, things are great. Why should we listen to you, Mr. or Miss New Guy? Because things are just peachy keen here. And so if you, the incoming CEO, have properly detected that the company is in the midst of a strategic inflection point and the way things are done in the past are not going to work in the future, you have a really challenging task. Now, obviously, when the performance is very bad, you have challenges in terms of keeping morale up in the turnaround situation, but people are typically receptive to change because they understand that change needs to happen. Likewise, the board of directors. Some boards are very powerful, very strong, and they kind of want to put the training wheels on the CEO and make most of the big decisions. Other boards give the CEO more latitude, or at least at a minimum, are more receptive to hearing innovative ideas from the CEO. As I make this video, and this, I hate to do this because this video may become rapidly outdated because of this very point. Yahoo seems to be at a critical joint point in its restructuring, or not restructuring, but in its future, because they're looking now at selling the company, selling off the company, those sorts of things. And it's interesting because in the Wall Street Journal, they're talking about the fact that the current CEO, Marissa Mayer, is not being invited to some of the board discussions where they're talking about possible sale options or possible future strategic options. Obviously, that means that they think they know what she thinks, or they know what she thinks and they're going to reject it, or they don't have any confidence in her. None of those scenarios are very good for the CEO. And then you get into the shadow of the predecessor. Sometimes CEOs step down, but they don't go away. They may become the chairman of the board. They may sit on the board, and that potentially could limit what the new CEO is doing. An example of where this doesn't seem to have been a big problem is in the Microsoft CEO succession. The new CEO seems to be making big changes, even though Bill Gates and still Steve Ballmer, the founder, former CEO, and then the former CEO, friend of the founder, are still on the board and still engaged. So, there's no cookie cutter right or wrong things here. of all the lessons that I get a little bit ticked off because the Air Force didn't teach me, this is it. I told you that when I became a fighter squadron commander, I had a very competent person running the flying side of the organization and a very competent person running the maintenance side of the organization. And in a fighter squadron, that's what it's about. So you sit back as a squadron commander and go, well, what am I supposed to do? And the answer is you're supposed to do these three things because you don't have to be down in the trenches making all the detailed decisions. One is setting a direction. We've been talking about that a lot throughout this course, and you are actively engaged in that in the BSG simulation right now. So you're all about that. You understand that one. And that's a big part of what you do. That's why I say you have to have some latitude in the vision to be a strategic leader, because you have to be able to determine a direction. Then you set about designing the organization. We talk about that in the previous chapter, but I cannot overemphasize in the real world how important this is. And it's not just about getting the functional versus matrix versus SBU wiring diagram correct. It's about putting the right people into the right jobs. And this is why ultimately the CEO, I think, is very responsible for the business, because they put those people there. They put them there to do a job. They trained them, they mentor them, they counsel them, and ultimately, if need be, they fire them. So do not discount just how important this is. I can tell you, I spent, when I was in that fighter squadron commander position, my chief of pilots, very capable guy, was going off on another assignment, and I had to hire his replacement, which a lot of times they don't give the squadron commander a lot of latitude in that. Well, I wanted a particular guy, and I spent months lobbying to get him as my, what was called the operations officer. And ultimately I succeeded. And let me tell you, that guy made me look very, very good. It was a great decision on my part that took months of action, but it was months that were well spent. And then lastly is this idea of building the culture. Now, in this slide it says excellence and ethical behavior. I certainly agree with those points. But the point is, you're going to have to build that culture. You're going to have to take stock of what is the culture right now and what do I want it to be. Certainly an entrepreneurial culture is important. Some people would say a high performance culture is important. The real cautionary tale is there are lots of cultures that are not positive. And you have to understand that, and you have to be willing to do the things necessary to change those cultures, such as setting a new vision, very consistently establishing that, establishing the norms of behavior, and then you get down to the point of you tell people you get on the bus or you get off the bus, and you take steps to do that, sometimes very symbolic steps that we'll talk about on the next slide. That's a huge part of what you do, is you are the chief culture officer in an organization. I included this slide. This is another leading textbook. You can see they have 4 rather than 3. It's not that I disagreed with the 3, it's that I wanted you to see another perspective on it. And notice that final point where the balanced organizational controls. We talked about the balanced scorecard earlier in our time together this semester, went through it very quickly. Here's the idea that you have to have the checkup mechanism, if you will. You have to see how are things going and are things happening right. The article I asked you to read is a classic. The original was actually published back in the early 1970s, and when you read the article, you may be tempted to think, well, this sounds pretty outdated to me, because he talks very negatively about the information systems. Remember, when he wrote that article, email didn't exist. The internet didn't exist. And you could say, whoa, things are very different now because people video chat and they read emails and they get information off of dashboards. All true. But if you think about it, the basic roles that Mintzberg described are still valid. So what amazes me is not what's changed. It amazes me how much has not changed since he wrote that article over 40 years ago. This is an article I wish the Air Force would have had me read, because it would have allowed me to look at things differently. For example, you get up there in that figurehead role, which is not something I really enjoyed very much, but you realize that is an opportunity to set the culture of an organization. Likewise, you get down into the conflict stage where you're having to resolve conflict. Again, this is a key point where you're not only making decisions and setting the direction, but you're also setting key cultural lessons. So I love that article. I encourage you to print it out and keep this article or save it, because there's tremendous value in what it has to say. In the final video, I'm going to talk about a little bit about the rest of the textbook chapter, but we're going to talk on a couple of issues that are particularly important to me.